Welcome back to the channel. This is my new to me 2004 Corvette Z06, and of course it's already broken, so today we're going to fix the P0492 engine light. The repair for this should be about the same on the Z06 and the base models, but this is a secondary air system fault code. Now for what's wrong, coming here to the driver's side of the car, you got your alternator here, you see this hose behind it and it comes up, it's got this valve with this little clip behind it, and then the hose goes back behind the intake manifold. These check valves, there's one here and there is one up behind the intake manifold. Those are what get clogged up and cause this code. Those valves get stuck because they get built up with gunk over time, and usually the one that gets more corroded of the two is the one that you have to remove the intake manifold to get to, because of course Chevy did that, why wouldn't they? So there's two fixes. The quick band-aid fix, if you haven't really had this problem before, is you basically spray a cleaner and a lubricant into these hoses, you try to push it up with compressed air, and you're trying to clean out the valve so it functions properly again without fully replacing it. So I'm going to start by showing how to do that, but if the code keeps coming back like it does on this car, you are going to have to replace the other valve and you have to pull the intake manifold to do that. If you're at the point that you know you need to replace the valve, I'll put a timestamp here, jump to this part of the video, that's where I'm going to start that section. But first things first, let's start with the cleaning in case you just want the band-aid fix. Alright, cleaning step one, don't. Because it's not the right way to do it. But you'll probably ignore that, so let's get on with it. Start by removing this little clip on the back side of this one valve. The easiest way I found to do that was to pry up with one finger while twisting a flathead screwdriver inside of the clip. Then I used the same flathead screwdriver to slowly pry off this hose. Just do your best to not tear the hose because these hoses are stupidly expensive for some reason. With the hose off, you're going to use preferably a throttle body cleaner, but you could also use a carburetor cleaner, and you're going to spray it into this hose here. Then you'll use compressed air at 25 psi to push the cleaner up through to the other check valve that is behind the intake manifold. Now carburetor cleaner is a lot more aggressive, so if you're repeatedly cleaning it out this way, just keep in mind that carb cleaner is more likely to dry out and crack your hoses from the inside, which is not a good thing. That said, this is a band-aid fix either way and not the proper way to be repairing this, so you do you. It ain't my car and it ain't my problem. So I'm starting by putting my air nozzle in there and just making sure it seals relatively well within that hose. Once again, 25 psi is the most you really want to use here. If you go more than that, you might overpressure the system, which is a bad thing. I make it like my Friday night and give it a quick test blow to get any debris out of there. Then I take my throttle body cleaner, I put the hose on it so I can get this as far in as I can, and then give it a nice big, excessively healthy squirt. And listen to the tone here real quick. You can hear it getting to that high-pitched whine. That is how you know you have added enough and that this pipe is pretty much full. Now that it's filled up with the cleaner, you're going to use your air nozzle, put it in there nice and tight to seal it as best as you can, and then again, about 25 psi, use that to push it down through the system to clean out the old valve. It's also not a bad idea to surround this with a rag just to catch a little bit of that excess blow off. And as always, when you're spraying, you should use protection to prevent unwanted fluid from getting all over your eyes and hands. But seriously though, use some sort of eye protection. If you're not sealing it properly, guess where it's gonna come? Right back onto your face. You're going to repeat the process of using the cleaner followed by the compressed air about 5 times. Now I used the compressed air for about 20 to 30 seconds and then refilled it up and then did it again. So some people on the forums insist on going 1 to 5 minutes before refilling it, but to me at least that seemed a little bit excessive. But on the very last time you do it, you do want to spray it for 1 to 5 minutes because you want all of that cleaner to flash off and dry out so it's not there in the way when you put the lubricant in the next step. And that next step is effectively doing the same thing but with WD-40. Now you don't want to oversaturate the system here, so you're not looking to just kind of fill it up like I almost did with the cleaner. You only want to spray for about 3 to 5 seconds into there to get enough. Then when you go to the compressed air, 20 to 30 seconds is all you need because again, you don't want to dry this out completely. You want a little bit in there so the valve actually functions. And allow me to repeat this again, use safety glasses because you can see how much is spraying absolutely everywhere here. It's also a good idea to have a rag nearby for cleanup because I had a nice and soaked oily engine bay after doing this. But you know what else I had? My eyesight. Because I used safety glasses. Once you're satisfied with how well you've cleaned up the dripping mess from the back of your hose, you are ready to reinstall the hose onto the back of that first valve. You gotta put the clamp back on as well. I just closed it with a pair of pliers, but make sure you don't over clamp this thing either, because this is a plastic piece that's next to a heat cycling engine. It's gonna be brittle and it's probably going to break if you do something stupid. 1 to 2 clicks is all you really need. You just want it tight enough that it can't be rotated by finger strength. And at this point, use your scan tool to clear the engine code and pray to whatever god you believe in that it doesn't come back. But let's be real, it's going to come back because that's how cars work. Now, if you spray WD-40 everywhere, you're also going to smell that flashing off the first time you start up the car again, so just be aware of that. But congratulations, because now you have finished the Band-Aid fix. But let's go over the proper way to do this, because it's not a matter of if your engine light's going to come back on, but when it will come back on. So what I suggest is, if you have to clean it out, order the new valve now, which brings us to part 2, fixing this properly by actually replacing the valve. Now, if you're getting ready to do this job and you're ordering parts, you should order the new valve. You should also order a new gasket set for the intake manifold. You'll need a 7/8 inch as well as a 1-inch wrench. And if you've been considering a swivel head ratchet, this is a really good time to get one. You'll need a tool to disconnect the fuel line going into the intake manifold, and I also recommend buying new intake manifold bolts. Now, these bolts are something like $30 for the set, but if you try to reuse the old ones, they get very, very brittle, which means they don't give you any warning. They just instantaneously snap and then leave a large portion of it in your engine block, which is not the most fun thing to deal with, and something that I might have done on this car. I'll discuss that more in the sister video to this, which I'll link below, where I'm getting the car ready for an autocross day. But seriously, if your car's about 20 years old and over 80,000 miles, spend the $30 and just save yourself the hassle, because most likely these things are going to snap at some point. And first things first, I don't have footage of this, but you're supposed to disconnect the negative battery terminal, which of course I did, right? That was convincing. As for the location of the valve that we are replacing, it is up here behind the intake manifold, kind of like halfway under the dash, right up next to the firewall. It is way up in there. There is no way to get this without pulling that intake manifold off, and believe me, I tried. There's a lot of videos out there and instructionals and forums that tell you how to remove an intake manifold and how to put on a new one. I'm not going to go into an extreme level of detail on how to pull this out, but I will do a general overview as we go along this. The first thing we're going to do is pull off these bright red covers, and next there's a little tiny valve on the end of the fuel rail. You're going to be pressing this valve in to depressurize the fuel system, and obviously you don't want fuel spraying everywhere, including in your eyes, so I highly suggest that you use some sort of a rag to catch that fuel so you don't, spray your whole engine bay with a flammable substance, because most people consider that to be not the brightest idea. Once you have that depressurized, you're going to use that tool I talked about earlier to remove the fuel line. This is just a pretty standard off-the-shelf tool, and because there's a chance that this might still have fuel in it, I suggest you point it up so that the fuel doesn't drip down, again going into your engine bay as a flammable substance, because that's bad. Next, I'm going to unplug the wiring harness from all the fuel injectors. On an older car, these could be a little bit brittle, so just be a little careful on that. And we'll also need to disconnect the throttle body on the air intake. As you can see here, the easiest approach is sometimes just becoming a trapeze artist and crawling over the top of this thing, because even at 6'2", my arms were not quite that long. With the throttle body taken care of, you're ready to start unbolting the intake manifold. Now, there's 10 bolts, but the last 2 in the very back of the engine are hidden, and they are a pain to get to. But why wouldn't they be? Because the valve is also a pain to get to. This being my first time working on an LS engine, even once I had all these things out, as much as I wiggled and jiggled this thing, I could not get the intake manifold to come right off. The bolts for the intake manifold are fairly long bolts, and the very last 2 in the very back of the engine, they're so long that you can't pull them straight up and actually get them out, because you have that whole dash area kind of overhanging that section of the engine, which means you have to pull them up most of the way so that they clear the engine block and don't get stuck, but you can't go too high or they get caught and then you can't pull this thing out. So what I did is use zip ties to hold them somewhere in the middle where they were high enough to not catch the engine block, but not so high that they caught the dashboard above it, and so that I could use my hands to actually maneuver this thing instead of just holding these two bolts. You could forego the zip tie trick if you have two people to hold this and two sets of hands to do everything, but you're probably spending your free time watching this video because you're lonely like me. Even with this trick, there's a lot of persuading that has to be done to get this thing out. I went back and I had to loosen up the throttle body even more and completely remove it and push it to the side. I had to go back and kind of push and pull on different cables and wires, make sure everything was out of the way. But with some patience, pliers, and persuasion, we are able to finally get this thing moved off and out of the way so that we can get to our check valve. That is, of course, after removing even more connectors and hoses from the back of the intake manifold, because why wouldn't that be a convenient location? Now for removing the valve, there's two issues here. The first is access. So there's a 7/8 inch nut on the hard line and a 1-inch nut on the valve, and getting a wrench that is those sizes into that area, you don't have great access, and you can see they stick out like 3 or 4 inches past the dashboard, so you can only turn them like a 1/4 inch at a time. Problem number two is because this is right off the back of the engine in the hottest area of the entire car, and because it's got gunk built up on the inside, which is why you have to change it, that joint is absolutely fused together. So the level of force that you are going to need to separate this, you're unlikely to be able to apply that level of force while the valve is still in the car. You're better off removing the valve with the entire hose attached than trying to get the valve off after and reinstalling the entire thing again. Now there's also a little slotted bracket that holds this stupid valve in place, and because it's slotted, instead of having a hole drilled through it, you can just loosen the bolt rather than completely removing it to get this out. So I'm going to show that here now. And then on the other end, this plugs into the top of the block, and then you just have 2 bolts to remove there, and this entire hose comes out and is finally free at last. So with that, let's go on to the next phase of trying to remove this stupid thing from the old hose. What I very quickly realized was there was no way to try to unscrew this without putting it in the vise because it was so caked on, and even when I initially held it by the bracket, it was still too caked on. And when I repositioned it in the vise grip so that the vise was holding one nut while I turned the other, it was still too caked on, to the point that I just used my angle grinder to cut off the body of the valve because I was stripping the threads otherwise. Now this will let you hammer a socket or the multi-point enclosed part of the wrench over the top of this so that way you actually have a good enough gripping surface. Otherwise, you're going to round this off. Let's just cut to some real-time footage here of how caked up and gross and corroded the inside of this is. It's not a wonder at all that these threads are sticking, that this thing won't come loose. What I had to do was torch the crap out of this thing, soak it in penetrating oil, and then torch it some more while I worked to get it loose. And top tip, if you want to be successful at removing this, use some needle nose pliers or like a steel brush or something to chip away as much of that corrosion as you can prior to spraying the penetrating oil. Otherwise, it's not really going to get down into the threads. But alas, we had great success, but at the expense of completely destroying and deforming this nut. But the good news is, now you're ready to install the new one. So what I would do is clean up any gunk that's on the old threads, using either some sort of a brake cleaner or a degreaser, or maybe even a wire brush if you're a really brave soul, and do what you can to clean out any gunk on the inside of the hose as well, so that you're not doing this again in a couple months in case it gets loose and clogs your new valve, because that would not be pleasant. With the new valve installed though, you are ready to start putting everything back together, but before you do that, I recommend taking this time while the intake manifold is off to start cleaning up your engine a little bit and to clean out your intake plenums while you have the chance. Especially if this took you more than a couple hours to do, it's a good idea to vacuum them out in case any dust or debris fell into those intake plenums. And because my car has 80-something thousand miles, it's almost 20 years old at this point, I also use some degreaser with a rag to try to clean these out a little bit and remove some of that carbon buildup. Not only does it make things look cleaner, but that's probably good for, I don't know, like 400 or 500 horsepower at the wheels. I'm not too good with numbers, but that sounds right. And now we're also going to get the intake manifold itself ready for installation with some new gaskets, and you don't want to put this directly on the ground because there's a risk that you'll pick up dirt or debris or dust or whatever else, and that could go into your engine, and that's not exactly good. So you can see here I'm using a clean piece of cardboard to keep this off of the ground and to give me a cleaner working surface. The gaskets that I got not only came with the gaskets, it also came with these replacement foam pieces for the 2 ends of the intake manifold. So pick out the old gaskets, pull off the old foam pieces, clean out what you can, and then put the new ones in. It's pretty straightforward, but now that things are prepped and and cleaned, you are ready to get this reassembled. I got the new valve and hose back in place. I put that stupid slotted bracket that attaches to it back on the bolt and tightened that bolt down, and then started finagling the intake manifold back into its rightful place, you know, where the intake manifold goes. Just like with the removal, I'm not going to do a full tutorial on reinstalling the intake manifold. There's a lot of them out there. They're very detailed. The one thing I do want to note is the two very backmost bolts. You do have to put those through the intake manifold before you slide this thing into place, or you won't be able to install them. But once you have the intake manifold in place, we're ready to bolt it down. It's going to be a star pattern starting at the center and then working out for these bolts. 89 inch-pounds is the torque spec, which comes out to about 7.5 foot-pounds. So here's what I would suggest based on this. Number one, if your torque wrench is at the absolute bottom of its range and you feel like you're over-tightening it because it's a massive torque wrench on a really low setting, just trust your instincts and maybe don't use that and just go, you know, a little bit more than hand snug, because that's about what this torque spec is. Now, another note I want to make is that you should make sure all of your connectors and sensors are plugged in, because I might have missed one of those, and then when I went to start up the car afterwards, which is going to be the next step after getting this set up, I got 4 engine lights immediately because I left one of the throttle position sensors unplugged. So if you screw up, you forget to plug something in, it's not going to blow up your engine, but you are going to figure it out pretty quickly, because it's either not going to run right or your car is going to throw a bunch of engine lights and go into limp mode. But that said, once you get the whole car together, you got the throttle body back on, all the hoses reconnected, you first need to prime your fuel system. Effectively just turn it to the on position but don't start the car, and then do that 2 or 3 times. You're just trying to repressurize it basically, and then you are ready to give the car a test fire. Now use your OBD2 scanner, make sure there's no new codes, and then clear the old code once you figure out that the car is running properly. Make sure you don't excessively smell gasoline. If you do, those gaskets that you put in the intake manifold might be leaking, but other than that, you are good to go. So I'd take it easy the first time or two just to make sure nothing's wrong, especially if you're newer to doing things yourself. But hopefully this helped you out. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.